welcome. Tonight, imagine yourself standing on the shifting deck of a long, narrow galley, the hush of the sea stretching endless under a moon that floats pale above black water. A cold wind slips between loose planks and damp sails, carrying the salt scent of distant shores that promise both silver and struggle. This is the world of the Ottoman Corsair, part sailor, part raider, part silent shadow, drifting along coasts that feared the whisper of oars more than the thunder of open war. Tonight, we drift gently alongside them, feeling the hush beneath each swing of an oar, the quiet dread of lanterns snuffed before dawn raids, and the soft prayers murmured by those who clutched cold blades under starlight. Rest easy here on this calm tide. Let your thoughts bob gently on the hush that rocked these sailors awake and rocked them to sleep, when they could sleep at all. For a while, we will explore the salt and silence of their nights, the slow rhythm of their days, the quiet stories hidden in hulls and harbors. Picture yourself here, barefoot on damp planks that creak softly with every roll of the sea. The night air clings to your skin, sharp with brine, and the faint tank of tar used to caulk gaps that never seem to stay closed. The hush hums underfoot in the endless slap of waves against the hull. Soft at first, then a constant rhythm you cannot shut out. Your fingers blister where rope rubs salt into raw skin. The hush of sails overhead is broken now and then by the low rasp of a pulley, a distant cough from a man half asleep at his post. Sleep comes in scraps. You doze curled against a coil of rope, your cloak thin against the damp that seeps up from boards soaked through with old storms and older voyages. You share this hush with dozens of others, each pressed so close you feel the warmth of another man's breath when the hush grows cold before dawn. Below decks, the hush thickens, the cramped hush of sweat and stale air, where chained rowers pull steady oars through night tides. You do not envy them, yet sometimes you feel the hush pressing your shoulders too, as if you too are bound to this bench, this hush that hums louder than any chant of prayer. When the wind fails, as it often does, the hush shifts to groaning timbers and the soft splash of oars dipping in and out of a black sea. You brace your hands on the rail, watching a distant coast drift closer, the hush of land promising respite that never comes without risk. In hidden coves, the hush is broken by whispers of raiders gathering blades, checking pistols wrapped in oilcloth to keep the salt from corroding iron that must speak quick when the hush breaks into shouts. Meals are quiet too. Stale bread, a cup of thin wine that tastes more of barrel than grape, fish pulled from nets that drift behind the hull, sometimes eaten raw when the hush of the wind refuses fire. You eat with your back to the sea, watching for sails on the horizon that might mean another hush broken by cannon or by a sudden clash of steel on deck. In the hush before dawn, you lie awake with your head against damp planks, listening to the slow groan of the hull. You think of quieter hushes, the hush of home harbors, the hush of warm stone courtyards, far from this salt breath of wind. But for now, the hush belongs to the sea, and you belong to it too, bound by coin, by fear, by the slow tide that hums you toward another coast you may not leave behind. On this deck, the hush is never fully yours. You share it with gulls that circle slow above the mast, their cries threading through the hush like thin threads of thought you can't quite hold. You hear the hush crack under boots crossing the planks in darkness, an officer checking ropes, a cook's boy slipping leftover crusts to oarsmen who wake and sleep by the hush of the oar's pull. Imagine your breath rising in the hush just before a storm. Clouds gather low and heavy, blotting out stars you used to read for a promise of calm passage. Now the hush brims with the rattle of sails drawn down quick, the slap of wet rope coiled in hands, numbed by salt and wind. You taste the hush in rain that leaks through seams above your bunk, a hush that soaks blankets already stiff with sea brine. Your sleep is short and shallow. In dreams, you drift not on gentle waves, but on the hush of rumors that slip between men huddled near the galley's low fire. Whispers of a prize ship anchored just beyond the next headland, its hush broken by coin clinking in a captain's purse. A hush of warnings, too, of coastal forts bristling with iron that waits for sails like yours to break the hush of dawn. When the sea calms, the hush lingers. The galley drifts on flat water, so still it feels like glass under a hull never built for hush so wide and deep. Rowers below shift on benches that stink of hush pressed into skin and wood alike. A hush that holds secrets of men taken from coasts far from here, chained not by oath but by iron that hums in the hush of every stroke. Some nights the hush opens just enough for laughter, low, cautious, always glancing at the shadows that might hush it with a single look, a song hummed under breath, a dice game played near lanterns, hooded so tight the hush barely flickers, a story of easy coin and softer beds waiting in Tunis or Algiers, when the hush of port lifts the sea's hush from your shoulders for a night or two. But always the hush returns. It presses cold into joints that ache from damp hours crouched under a battered sail. It hums under your ribs when you lean over the rail and watch your own reflection slip and break in water, dark enough to swallow the hush whole. In the hush before another dawn, your mind drifts to shores you might raid tomorrow. Farms set back behind dunes, small villages whose hush you'll break with iron and torch if the captain gives the nod. You wonder if their hush will ever carry your hush back across these waters. Stitched into prayers, spoken by families who see sails on the horizon and remember only hush turned harsh. And so you stand again when the oars dip steady and the hush rolls on, carrying you farther from quiet harbors you left behind. The hush is salt and rope, iron and breath. It is the hush you regret but cannot leave, because you know the hush is the sea's alone, and you, tonight, belong to both. Imagine now the hush that hums, not only through the planks beneath your bare feet, but across whole harbors. A hush carried on rumors of a man whose red beard flickered like a standard. Above decks, bound for every shore, the empire's hush touched. Hayreddin Barbarossa, born Khizr, but known to hush and roar alike as Redbeard, rose from narrow creeks and hidden coves to the hush of an admiral's cabin, where velvet maps stretched the hush farther than any single oar could pull. His hush began as a younger brother's vow. His older brother, Aruj, was the first to lift iron against Christian ships that crossed the hush of North African waters. Together, they learned how to braid the hush of coastal folk, too long harassed by knights and kings, who called themselves crusaders, but struck villages with the same hush-breaking iron that corsairs would soon claim for their own. When Aruj fell in battle, the hush shifted to Khizr. He took his brother's hush and wore it like a cloak, dyed his beard red in memory and warning alike. In every hush that lingered behind captured galleys, his name spread wider. Barbarossa, the Red-Beard who sailed for the Ottoman Sultan, but owed his hush to no single port. His hush was clever. Where others struck with blunt force, he slipped through hush like a gull between gusts. His galleys slid into coves where fortresses could not reach. He courted local hush, coastal tribes, and port town elders, who saw his hush as shield and sword both. Sometimes he paid for supplies with hush instead of coin, a promise that next season the hush of Christian raids would break before it touched their piers. In Algiers, he anchored his hush deep. He turned its hush into a stronghold, a nest for scores of lean galleys whose hush spread through the western Mediterranean like salt blown from a storm. When local rulers bent knee to European crowns, Barbarossa's hush rose like a dark sail on the horizon, a hush that promised no easy landing for any who thought to claim hush from these coasts. Yet Barbarossa's hush was never only his own. It drifted back east to Istanbul, where the Sultan saw how the hush of corsairs might guard an empire's soft belly. In time, Barbarossa traded a piece of his hush for rank and iron. Grand Admiral of the Ottoman fleet, a hush tied to banners stitched with crescents, and the hush of prayers, lifted from mosques that gleamed above harbors brimming with hush-broken masts. Under Barbarossa's hush, raids turned larger, not just single galleys slipping through hush to steal livestock or ransom fishermen, but whole fleets that struck islands and coasts in summer's hush, pressing quiet dread from Spain's hush to Italy's hush and beyond. Captains swore hush to him alone, iron men who trusted that behind his red beard lay a mind that read the hush like a navigator reads stars. In the hush of his cabin, Barbarossa traced coastlines by oil lamp, listening for rumor more than cannon. He knew the hush of treaties bent when coin changed hands behind palace walls, how to slip hush between kingdoms too busy with each other to guard the hush of their own harbors. When the time came for storms, Barbarossa's hush roared like surf under a winter gale. When the time came for quiet, it slipped away into hush so deep a fleet might vanish behind an island reef and drift out. Again at dawn, with hush sharpened into fresh thunder. Long after his sails lowered for the last time, Barbarossa's hush never truly slept. It hummed in the creak of every new galley fitted in Ottoman ports, in the hush of oarsmen who murmured his name as if the hush still rode beside them in the salt night. Picture him now, standing at the rail of his flagship as dawn lifts a hush of thin mist from a calm sea, his cloak heavy with salt spray, boots braced wide against the hush of a swell that rocks lesser men to their knees. Barbarossa's hush hums, not only in the low slap of water against his hull, but in the measured hush of voices behind him. Officers murmuring orders so softly they never break the hush he carries around him like a second skin. For Barbarossa, the hush was beneath the hush of salt wind and creaking timbers lies another hush, heavier, closer to the ribs. It hums in the low hold where rowers bend their backs in the hush between each dip of the oar, the soft splash that marks their heartbeat against the hush of the sea. Imagine yourself there, crouched on the same worn bench, your ankle ringed with iron whose hush hums against bone when the ship rolls. Around you, men breathe hush into stale air thick with the faint temps of sweat and old salt. Some close their eyes when the hush grows too close, lips moving in prayers, half murmured to saints or prophets or ancestors. Whatever hush might listen when no other hush breaks the iron's grip. Some captives came to this hush by force, taken when dawn raids broke the hush of a coastal village, when iron knocked hush from a door in the hush before sunrise. Others fell to the hush at sea, pulled from merchant decks when corsairs struck swift under covers of hush so deep that watchmen never called alarm in time. Not every hush below deck is the hush of chains. Some came by choice or half choice, men who traded hush for freedom of another kind, apostates, renegades, converts who slipped their old hush behind locked chapel doors and stepped barefoot onto planks that hummed with the hush of new loyalties. They traded hush in one tongue for hush in another, prayers spoken under breath in languages that drifted along galleys from Tunis to Rhodes, from Algiers to Crete. The hush of these converts carries a soft mystery. Some wore hush-like armor, a new faith that promised iron would unlock, that hush would hum softer if they bent the knee in the right hush of prayer. Others kept the hush closer to the skin, crossing themselves under rough cloaks, whispering old oaths when no watch officer walked the hush between benches. Above them, the hush of their labor keeps the ship alive when the wind fails. Oars rise and fall in perfect hush, dozens moving as one breath, one rhythm. One hush of muscle turned to salt and iron. In that hush, they drift past headlands and into narrow bays, where hush breaks against rocks unseen in moonlight. Sometimes the hush breaks below deck too, a whisper of revolt. Oars dropped in sudden hush that snaps into shouts when chains rattle against bolts set deep into the hush of the hull. Guards hurry down ladders, their boots striking hush from planks that groan under hurried iron. But hush returns quickly, a hush of orders barked low, a hush of broken courage that folds back into tired arms, pulling oars through hush once more. Above, the hush of prayers drifts upward, a hush carried on the warm breath of rowers who do not know if they will see the hush of land again. Some hushes slip through deck seams at night, prayers for rescue, for ransom, for hush-turned freedom, if only hush stays patient enough to outlast the iron. For every hush locked in chains, another hush waits by the captain's cabin door. Letters sent to far-off courts, hush traded for coin and favor. A noble family's hush broken open when gold unlocks the hush below deck. Sometimes the hush holds steady. No ransom comes. No promise drifts back across the hush of these cold waters. And yet the hush below remains, an old hush woven into the bones of these ships. It hums in the hush of salt water dripping from oar blades, in the hush of breath that keeps pulling, in the hush of prayers that never stop slipping through the hush of iron and sea. Beneath the hush of sails snapping in a fresh wind, the hush of chains hums steady, carrying thoughts that never quite sleep. Some who sit chained to the hush of the oar dream of a coast they'll see again, a hush of stone houses above fields where wind hums through olive trees instead of plank seams. They carry that hush behind closed eyes, rocking gently in rhythm with the creak of the hull. Others have let go of that hush altogether. They press hush into each pull of the oar, each breath drawn under a roof that never stops moving. Their hush is narrower. Survive the night, survive the hush of the next dawn. Survive the iron that holds ankles firm when storms tilt the deck so sharply that cold spray slips through deck boards and drips hush down their backs. The hush here is not all despair. In quiet moments, when guards doze, when boots above tread, soft to check rope and sail, low hush drifts between benches, scraps of song passed mouth to mouth in languages braided from far shores, a prayer whispered from a man's lips into his own cupped hands, then dropped like a stone into the hush below the waves. Sometimes a convert sits among them, unchained now but never fully free of the hush. He speaks both sides of the hush of those who row and the hush of those who stand guard. In a corner of the hold, he might share a hush of news. Who among them might buy freedom if letters reach the right hush of a distant noble's ear, whose hush is watched too closely to ever slip the lock free? Above, the hush drifts into the captain's hush too. Not every chain means coin. A letter lost to storm or betrayal leaves hush to linger until no family's hush reaches far enough to pay it off. In that hush, a man may row until his hush fades to bones and rust, hush that feeds the planks when his breath is gone. And yet the hush of hope flickers, stubborn in the dark. He counts the hush of his strokes, the hush of his prayers, the hush of the waves tapping at the hull, as if the sea itself keeps time with the hush he clings to, the hush of whispered mercy, the hush of a promise spoken so low it might slip through iron and plank alike. Above them all, the hush of the sea hums patience. It knows every hush given up in the hold settles somewhere, in letters that cross kingdoms, in coins pressed into palms under palace arches, in the hush of salt winds that wash decks clean of blood but never truly of memory. So the hush holds these men close, bound or free, chained or converted. They breathe the hush together. Oars rise and fall, iron hums against wood, prayers drift like mist between ribs and sea. The hush carries them all forward, toward coasts they may see again or not, toward dawn that might break their hush open or leave it folded safe a little while longer. When the hush of the sea slackens under a rising sun, it slides gently onto stone quays and narrow streets lined with salt-crusted walls. Here, in the hush of bustling ports, the hush does not vanish, it changes shape. It hums in quiet deals struck behind carved doors, in coins pressed palm to palm under the hush of an awning drawn low against the glare. Picture yourself here, stepping ashore after weeks rocked by the hush of waves and oars. The hush of the port hums in new ways. The slap of sandals on flagstones, slick with fish scales. The hush of voices, layered one over another. Traders from inland markets. Corsairs seeking hush from city guards, who watch with eyes half closed, but ears always open. Every port along these shores hums with its own hush. Algiers, Tunis, Tripoli, each one a hush of guarded gates and wide courtyards where fountains gurgle softly under fig trees heavy with heat. In these courtyards, the hush shifts between shadows cast by tiled arches and the quiet presence of a bay's men leaning on spears, their hush more watchful than the hush of waves that brought you here. The local bays hold the hush together. They gather hush like a fisherman gathers nets, carefully, patiently, mending gaps with gifts and small threats, quiet taxes collected in the hush of night. A corsair's hush buys space to dock, safe storage for hush turned silver, a hush of permission to sell captives into hush softened by coin or favor. Sometimes the hush hums under coffee roofs, where men sit cross-legged on woven rugs, listening for the hush of news drifting from the docks. Who docked last night under hush of a moonless tide? Who slipped hush into a chest bound for Istanbul's hush-hungry court? Who lost hush to a sudden raid? Whose hush waits for revenge to find it in the next bay? For merchants, the hush is both danger and shield. They walk narrow lanes lined with hush, kept close behind barred shutters. They count hush in spices sealed in clay jars, in bolts of silk unloaded hush by hush from holds deeper than the hush of any promise spoken aloud. The hush here holds teeth, coastal forts built strong enough to hush a careless raid, but not so strong that the hush of coin cannot slip through gates when needed. At dusk, the hush folds itself around the walls. The last boats tie hush-tight to docks, slick with tide. Lanterns flicker to life, one by one. On balconies above the hush of crowded streets, the bays watch this hush, part ruler, part broker, part keeper of hush that must never slip too far from their grasp. They hear the hush in the shuffle of guards moving through arcades, the hush in the hush of papers signed in candlelight, promising next month's hush in new sails, new oars, new iron. Far beyond these courtyards, the hush hums back to the sea. It waits for the next tide, the next captain willing to trade hush for wealth and risk alike. For the men who stepped off the deck hoping for a taste of hush softer than wind and salt. The port's hush offers warmth and risk in equal measure. One slip in a dark alley, one hush spoken too loud at the wrong table, and the hush of the sea might claim them again before dawn. So the hush breathes here too, through tiled archways and busy docks, under fig trees and minarets. It wraps itself around the coastal hush like salt air clinging to wool cloaks still damp from the hush of open water. In these ports, the hush is older than any single fort or wooden dock. It hums in the bricks laid by hands long turned to hush themselves, in wells that draw hush up from deep aquifers, to splash softly in tiled basins where merchants rinse sweat and salt from faces weathered by sea hush. The hush greets every new sail that dips anchor outside harbor walls. Mooring lines creak as crews step ashore, their boots striking hush into stone lanes, worn smooth by centuries of quiet trade and sudden hush-breaking storms of iron. The hush shifts between feet and lips, a smile traded for passage money, a hush of warning whispered to a lookout perched above the customs gate. Behind carved doors painted in sun-bleached colors, the hush folds deeper. Here, the bays sit on cushions broad enough for hush to gather at their elbows. Their hush is soft but sharp, a hush of questions asked so lightly that no answer ever truly vanishes. A hush of coins stacked into neat piles under flickering lamps, a hush of scrolls pressed with seals that bind hush to hush. Tribute from a coastal village promised hush in return for protection from hush carried on sails beyond the horizon. Corsairs carry their own hush into these courtyards. They bow low, but their eyes watch every hush in the shadows. The hush of a rival captain leaning too close to the bay's ear. The hush of a servant girl moving through hush with a tray of coffee that hums steam into the thick air. A nod here, a coin pressed there. Hush drifts like incense through narrow doorways, where iron waits behind carved screens if the hush breaks too loud. Merchants, too, know how to buy hush here. They slip hush across tables in hidden alcoves, bargaining for the hush of safe passage to coasts where hush is more fragile. Sicily's hush, Malta's hush, small islands where the hush of knights and kings tangles with the hush of pirates who listen more to wind than to thrones. A hush paid well might mean sails untouched by sudden raids. A hush unpaid might mean a quiet knock on the door at dusk, a hush of threats tucked inside, polite smiles and shallow bows. And all the while, the hush outside shifts. Porters haul hush in barrels of oil stacked under awnings. Fishermen mend hush into nets torn by hush-broken storms, humming old songs that tie the hush of salt water to hush of stone walls rising behind them. In corners where spices pour hush into the air, cinnamon, cardamom, smoke from roasting beans, the hush hums, low between buyers testing the weight of hush in coin and favor. At night, the hush thickens. Minarets whisper the hush of prayers down into streets that hush themselves for a breath, then resume their hum. Lanterns swing on iron hooks above courtyard gates where guards stand half-shadowed, watching hush drift between shadows. A laugh, a hush of music leaking from an upstairs room. The hush of secrets traded under the hush of wind that tastes more of land now than sea. For every hush ashore, the hush of the sea waits just beyond. The next tide, the next galley pressed tight to the dock, the next hush whispered to a bay who sits quiet in the hush of his tiled hall, listening for what hush must be spent and what hush must be kept safe for storms yet to come. Beyond the hush of tiled courtyards and counting rooms, another hush gathers where light fades. In alleys so narrow to men passing brush hush off each other's cloaks. In hidden inlets where a single flick of oars shatters a hush to still to trust. Here the hush hums with tension, stretched tight between those who carry the same hush but serve it in different ways. A corsair's hush does not sail alone. Rivals watch the hush slip from one coast to another, tracking where hush turns to silver, where hush slips into rumor, where hush might be stolen before dawn cracks it open. Sometimes the hush hums under a false smile shared across a tavern table. Two captains pretending hush binds them tighter than it does. Voices low over cups of dark coffee that hide the hush of betrayal, waiting in a knife strapped to a calf. Picture yourself here, standing at the mouth of a side street where oil lamps flicker hush against walls, patched with plaster and old salt. A hush passes in the look between two men meeting under the cover of night. They nod once, each reading the hush in the other's shoulders. A hush that says, tonight. Hush might break before any promise can mend it. Some hushes spill onto quiet beaches where small crews land in silence, drawn by rumor that a rival's hush hides cargo worth more than next month's hush from the bay's haul. In that hush, words are few. Oars dip hush into black water. Boots leave hush in the sand until the first clash of iron breaks it open. Even then, the hush clings. Muffled grunts, the hush of breath pressed between teeth, the hush of waves pulling away, hush that might never be spoken again. At sea, the hush between rivals drifts closer than any storm. Two galleys might anchor within sight of each other, their hush drifting across the hush of tide. Crews watch each other through the hush of drifting smoke. Cooks tending fires that flick hush into the night. Lookouts tracing hush on the horizon for sails that might turn hush into chase before the hush of dawn. The hush also lives in the soft footfalls of spies moving through port streets. A hush of coin pressed into a stable boy's palm to learn when a rival captain plans to slip hush past the harbor chain. A hush of threats murmured in the hush of an inn room where shuttered windows trap stale air and too many secrets. For the bays who rule these hushes, rivalry is both risk and tool. A soft word from the bay's steward might shift the hush. Tip one captain's hush toward favor. Let another's hush drift out of reach. This hush shapes fortunes. A license granted or withheld, a shipment taxed lightly or forced to pay, hush heavy in coin and grain. Yet hush binds these enemies too. They all kneel to the hush of salt wind and the hush of the sea's slow demands. A captain who breaks the hush too carelessly, who slits a throat to public, spills hush into a courtyard meant for quiet profit, finds his hush closed off. No port willing to hush him in harbor, no bay willing to wrap his hush in protection when Rome's hush or Spain's hush comes looking for blood. So the hush hums tight, stretched thin as a blade's edge in the dark. It flickers under moonlight on narrow decks. It presses soft into backs, leaning over barrels of hush stolen from another's hold. The hush of rivalry never sleeps. It waits in shadows where footsteps vanish quick, where a whisper traded under hush tonight might drift back. Tomorrow, as thunder humming through iron drawn in a hush too close to hear before it's too late. The hush that hums between enemies is not always spoken aloud. It rides in the way a man's eyes flick to a corner table where a rival sits just far enough to pretend the hush still holds. It hums in the brush of a shoulder against a dagger hidden under layered cloth, the hush of a promise made weeks ago that tonight must test. In back alleys, behind the port's broad hush, small doorways open into rooms where hush thickens. A coin changes hands. A promise slides out from under a cloak. Wait here until the lantern flickers twice. The hush here tastes of sweat and oil, blades checked in shadows, whispers so low that even the hush of waves striking distant keystones can drown them out. Sometimes rivals share hush because they must. Two captains, caught in the same hush of bad weather, forced to tie their hush together for a night in an untrustworthy tavern. Their crews gather at opposite ends of a low-ceilinged hall, where lamps swing hush over mugs of wine turned sour in warm air. Dice clatter soft on worn tables. The hush of luck masking glances that flick two doorways, hands always resting on hilts. Outside the hush of walls, the night hums with small hushes that slip unnoticed. A scout crouched behind crates, stacked with hush traded in spices and bolts of cloth. He counts men, counts hush drifting between nods and murmured pacts. When dawn breaks, he'll carry this hush back to someone who wants it more. A bay who knows one. Rival's hush can buy him leverage over another's thunder. In hidden coves, the hush waits, sharper still. Lanterns covered quick when sails appear too close to trust. Oars lifted from dark water without a splash. To crews drifting quiet under cliffs that remember older hushes. Betrayals sealed with soft splashes as hush-broken bodies slide under. The hush here has no need for loud warnings. A single knock against a hull, a rope slipped loose, a knife drawn smooth from its sheath. Hush splits as quick as a wave's hush against rock. Some hushes settle debts quietly. A man who spoke too freely last season now stands silent in the hush of an old courtyard. His hush paid off by hands that lift his purse, leave it light where once it weighed down the hush of his word. He'll drift through back streets now, hush lost to him forever, except in the warning others carry under their breath when the hush grows tense. Yet, for all its sharp edges, the hush between rivals does not shatter. Far from the hush of stone keys and flickering lanterns, another hush waits where the sky folds low over dark water. It is the hush that settles just before the wind shifts. A breathless pause when every man aboard feels it, deep in ribs that already know the hush might not hold. Imagine yourself here, standing at the rail as dusk folds into black sea. The hush hums, gentle at first, a soft hush of waves lapping planks, of rope creaking where sails hang slack. But somewhere beyond the hush, the sky begins to stir. A low roll like hush turning restless, distant thunder folding hush into something new. Corsairs know this hush well. They stand under it, faces turned to the wind, feeling its edges sharpen. Orders pass in low hushes that tighten sails, check barrels strapped below deck. Hush that binds oars tight against the roll to come. Lanterns are snuffed before the wind finds them. Hush must ride the storm without flame to tempt it. When the storm breaks, hush cracks open. The first gust rattles spars like a cannon's hush turned roar. Waves rise from hush that once soothed the hull, now lifting it high enough to let the next wave slam hush back into planks, already swollen with old storms. The hush of prayer returns too, murmured at the mast, shouted over the winds, hush that drowns out oaths and orders alike. Below deck, the hush tightens. Men brace against benches, slick with salt spray, forced through seams that hush could never fully seal. Chains bite hush into wrists and ankles, iron humming its own hush, when wood groans and the whole hull shudders under waves that do not care who rows, who commands, who carries hush in pockets heavy with last week's coin. Sometimes the hush breaks only to fold back again. A mast cracks but does not split. A sail tears but holds just enough hush to carry the ship past the worst of the hush-churning sea. When dawn comes, the hush returns, heavy but calm. The hush of bodies curled on decks, slick with salt and rain. The hush of ropes untied, with trembling hands that remember how thin the hush is when nature whispers it away. Yet not every hush finds calm again. Along these coasts, the hush of storms has left bones hidden under shifting dunes, planks half buried where gulls watch the hush of tide reclaim iron and salt. Shipwrecks hum a hush older than any captain's hush. A hush that tells every man who sails that hush is never truly theirs to keep. Villagers know these hushes too. When storms roar far out, they wait along rocky shores for hush to drift in. Barrels broken from holds, cloth torn free to dry under warmer hush of sun when the sea grows generous again. Sometimes they find hush heavier than cargo. Men washed up in hush that hums through seaweed and shingle, breath gone where the hush gave out. Still, the hush calls them back. The same hush that steals hulls and oars returns them to wood for new hulls, iron to be beaten back into shape. Hush too by one more tide's worth of coin and promise. Corsairs gather hush again, patch sails in the hush of dry coves, mend benches in the hush of warm harbors that promise calm until the next hush rises out beyond the reach of stone walls. In the hush after a storm, every deck hums soft with memory, ropes coiled neat, sails stitched where hush tore cloth apart. Men walk the hush with heads lowered, boots pressing hush into planks that feel lighter now, but hold the hush of storms past and storms to come. In the hush that lives inside storms, no man's oath or iron chain holds sway. The hush that hums from wind and wave answers only to itself, bending masts and snapping sails like dry reeds in a hush too loud to silence. Picture the hush before the first true blow, a hush thick with breath held between teeth, eyes lifted to sails that billow and sigh before they twist sharp in the hush of a gust-turned knife. Oars lifted from brine slap back down when the hush tilts the hull, oarlocks creaking like teeth grinding hush into the timbers. Below deck, the hush is darker. Lanterns sway in their iron hooks, throwing hush in pools of flickering light over backs bent to brace against each lurch. Water leaks through, seams pressed tight by tar that can't hold hush when the sea wants its peace. Chains rattle hush across benches as rowers shift to find balance that won't come. Their hush hums in the soft rhythm of whispered prayers stitched to old names. Mothers, hush. Wives, hush. Children's hush, waiting far beyond this cold hush of salt and pitch. Above, the captain's hush must stand steady. He grips the rail with hands hardened by too many storms that taught him how the hush can turn on any man, no matter how many hushes he's traded for coin in favor. His voice tries to cut through the hush, but the wind swallows words before they reach the men who strain lines or hammer wedges back into place where hush broke loose. Some storms lift hush so high a man might believe he's riding the edge of the world. Waves tower above the deck, hush-made mountain, then hush crashing down in spray that soaks cloaks and roars, hush back into the hold. The hush between each wave feels like forever. That thin silence before the next crash, the hush of hope that the mast will hold, the hush of dread that it won't. When storms win, the hush changes shape again. A mast split at the base, a sail ripped free and swallowed by black water. Barrels roll loose below. Iron rattles out of racks that never should have broken. The hush turns to screams, short, sharp, then folded under surf that hushes everything but the wind's low moan. After, when calm returns, the hush drifts wider. Survivors cling to planks that bob on swells to quiet now. Hush pressed into skin turned white by cold wind and salt. They watch the hush of dawn break low on a line of cliffs, hoping hush will guide them to a cove where villagers light fires on the hush of the beach to drag broken hush ashore. Some hush drifts far. Planks wash up on distant beaches where no Corsair flag ever flew, their hush carried by children who find them half buried in hush left by tide. A scrap of sail, a barrel branded with a mark half faded by hush turned salt. Relics of hush that once roared across the deck and is now no more than driftwood. Yet storms feed the hush too. Wrecked beams patched into new ribs. Iron cannons fished from shallow hush to brace a new hull. A ship rebuilt from hush knows the hush deeper than a hull fresh cut from cedar and oak. Its timbers hum with old hush. Storms survived, storms lost. Hush folded into hush until the next black sky rises from the edge of calm. So men stand on these decks again, eyes turned to the hush of horizon, where cloud banks roll low and dark. They trust the hush under their boots to hold. They trust the hush above to wait a little longer before it speaks again. And always, behind them, the hush of prayers hums on, a hush that rides every wave, waiting to see who it claims and who it lets drift home once more. Where hush rides, waves, and hums in planks below, it also waits on shore, anchored in stone watchtowers and fortresses perched on headlands where wind slips hush through narrow arrow slits. Imagine yourself there, standing on a battlement where the hush of the sea drifts upward, carried by gulls wheeling above the hush of salt spray, striking cliffs below. These fortresses are old hush-made rock, built stone by stone to hold hush steady against sails that might slip the hush of walls by night or fog. Guards stand within this hush for hours that stretch like rope pulled tight, a hush broken only by the soft clink of chainmail shifting on shoulders grown numb under salt wind. They lean into the hush, eyes narrowed to the hush of the horizon, watching for the first speck of a sail that means hush must turn alarm. Some nights, the hush settles thick as wool. Torches flicker low behind battlements, where lookouts pace hush into frost-rimed flagstones. Beyond the hush of lamps, the sea blurs into sky, and the hush hums, so wide a man might believe no threat could slip through. Yet Corsair sails know how to fold themselves inside this hush, hugging shorelines. Hugging hush until their hulls press hush up under the fortress walls before a single shout can rise. Within the fortress, the hush shifts again. Storerooms hum with the hush of grain measured out in quiet handfuls, a hush of salt pork, dried fish, casks of water meant to hold a garrison, hush for weeks if needed. Cannons line hush along parapets, their bronze muzzles aimed at the hush of any galley bold enough to test hush with thunder. But iron alone cannot watch every hush, so eyes stay sharp, ears tuned to the hush of waves that can carry oars, hush deep into the stones below. Villagers inland live in the hush of these walls too. They trust hush to hold back the hush that sails bring when the hush of coin fails. They gather behind gates that groan hush when closed at dusk, their hush layered with soft prayers, quiet bargains struck in the hush of candlelight. Keep us safe behind the hush. Let the hush outside break somewhere else. Within the hush of courtyards, soldiers pass hush among themselves. A flick of cards by lamplight, the hush of boots thumping slow patterns on steps that wind from barracks to watchposts above. Sometimes the hush tightens when news drifts in on hush carried by riders. A raid along the next headland, a hush broken at sea that might drift this way by dawn. Then the hush grows brittle. Archers check arrows by torchlight. Oil pots line hush along walls where iron grates hum under calloused palms. But hush here is patient too. Whole seasons pass with no sail breaking the hush of the horizon. In those hushes, fortress stones hum with other stories. Gossip slipped through hush-thick walls. Lovers meeting in hush behind gates where no captain's hush can find them. Small hushes that keep men warm when wind carries salt through cracks in battlements, older than any hush they'll ever stand watch for. Still, the hush of these towers never truly sleeps. It waits in the whistle of gulls that ride the hush above cliff edges. It hums in the hush of pebbles skittering down a narrow path where a single footfall might slip hush into warning. It waits in the hush of every eye turned seaward, ready to break the hush wide when the shape of a sail dares the hush to hold. Above the hush of breaking surf, these stones stand below the deck where boots thud and sails flap in the hush of open wind. Another hush waits, thicker, closer, pressed into every plank that holds back the hush of the sea just inches away. Imagine yourself here, crouched low under beams too short to stand tall, where shadows stretch long between flickering lanterns that hang in the hush above rows of men bound to oars. This hush has its own rhythm. It hums through the steady dip of wood blades into black water. Each oar rises and falls in perfect hush, a heartbeat that binds men together even when their minds drift far from the hush pressed between their ribs. The hush between oars is warm with breath and salt. It smells of sweat rubbed deep into benches, polished by years of hush-turned labor. When the ship cuts fast through calm seas, the hush lifts. The wind and sails take over. But when the wind fails, the hush comes back heavier, settling into joints and shoulders that know the hush does not forgive weakness. Each man learns to carry his hush differently. Some stare at the hush just ahead, the curve of the man's back who rows in front, shoulders rising and falling with each hush of the oar's pull. Some drift inward, hush folded around thoughts of dry land and soft beds where no hush hums like this, close and constant. The hush below deck hums at night too, when oars rest lashed to the hull. Men shift in their hush. Some stretch out on benches, slick with the hush of their own sweat. Some curl under cloaks that smell of salt and pitch. Soft hushes drift up in muttered talk, where the ship goes next. Who might slip hush into a guard's hand for a chance at a shore leave no chain allows? Sometimes the hush cracks open. A bench shifts under a wave's roll. A chain scrapes hush off iron rings. A man coughs too hard in hush meant to be steady. A hush of boots echoes above. An officer checking that the hush below does not slip into whispers of revolt, or the hush of plans that might break. The hush of these planks for good. For some, the hush becomes a second skin. They live years in it. Hush so deep they forget the shape of the sun on skin, or the feel of hush not broken by the drip of brine through seams packed tight with pitch. They learn to listen for the hush of waves slapping just beyond their reach. Reminders that hush is freedom, if only oars would stop dipping hush into open water. Yet the hush between oars is not only chains, it binds men who would otherwise break alone. They hum hush into old work songs, low voices weaving hush through planks and ribs alike. In this hush they share warmth, scraps of food tucked under benches, a word passed in the hush that lifts a man's head when the hush of despair presses too close. And always the hush drifts upward, through seams and boards, through the hush of sails catching wind again. When the hush shifts above, the hush below knows before any word is spoken. A gust, a change in the captain's hush on deck, the sudden hush of boots moving fast, then oars lift from water. Hush broken for a breath before settling back into the steady pull that carries hush and hull alike forward into another night. In this hush below deck, every sound carries more weight than it does above. A single chain link sliding along the bench hums louder than the creak of sails overhead. A quiet groan when a shoulder stiffens. A cough muffled into a sleeve. Small breaks in the hush that remind each man how closely he lives beside another's hush. There is little light here, only the hush of lanterns swinging on iron hooks nailed into beams blackened by smoke and salt mist. Shadows pool around ankles and wrists where iron keeps hush locked tight. Even when the sea outside calls with a hush so wide it feels almost merciful compared to this tight hush pressed between planks. Some men mark time by hush alone. The hush of oars lifted at sunrise, the hush of short sleep when wind fills sails enough to let chains lie slack for an hour or two, the hush of boots crossing the deck above, soft when the watch changes, heavy when the hush breaks into orders that snap men awake to row again. The hush teaches them to listen in ways they did not know before. A faint drip of water from a seam tells them whether the hull's hush holds strong or leaks its secrets into the hold. A shift in the hush of waves against the hull might mean land lies near. A promise hidden inside hush, so subtle, only men long pressed into these benches know how to hear it. Sometimes the hush between oars folds itself into murmurs, a prayer passed from man to man, each adding a word under breath, layering hush upon hush until the rhythm feels softer for a moment. Other times they hum old verses that slip hush around the beat of wood, blades dipping in and out. The song stays low, a hush that floats under ribs, reminding each man he is not the only one who feels the hush pressing into his bones. In rare moments when the hush eases, when wind and tide favor sails, Men stretch out in hush, broken only by snores and the soft hush of restless feet. Some dream of hush turned soft again, the hush of a village lane at dusk, the hush of a mother's hand over a restless child's brow, a hush without iron, without salt, pressed so deep into skin it tastes like the sea when sweat runs into cracked lips. But not every hush here is gentle. There is the hush of betrayal, too, an offer whispered in the hush of darkness. Slip that key under your bench when the watch turns. Hold the hush of my escape, and I will hush your chains with coin. Many promises drift through this hush. Few last long enough to free more than the tongue that risked the words. Above, the hush knows its cost. Quartermasters check hush in rations, counted out by dim lanterns. Water barrels drip hush into mugs, the taste of iron hoops, rusted by years of hush, riding wave after wave. Dried fish, stale bread, hush that feeds the hush just enough to keep oars moving. Yet, for all its weight, the hush holds more than misery. Men learn to breathe with it, to braid their hush together so tightly that when iron rattles loose, by bribe, by luck, by bargain struck somewhere above, the hush does not scatter into noise but lifts them in quiet, unity back to the open hush of the world above. So the hush hums here still, oars rising and falling like slow, patient breath. A hush that promises tomorrow might bring wind enough to let iron lie untouched for a while. And until then, the hush between ribs and planks rocks gently on the same tide that carries it all toward the hush of distant shores. Beyond the hush of creaking oars and damp planks, there waits another hush, the hush of coin slipping from one palm to another, quiet as a promise sealed behind courtyard doors and heavy shutters. This hush does not roar like cannon or creak like sails. It breathes soft between scribes and stewards, who know that hush is worth as much as iron when spoken at the right table. Imagine yourself here, seated cross-legged on a worn carpet in a shaded hall. The hush drifts warm through lattice windows, carrying the soft chatter of doves perched on tiled roofs. Beside you, a merchant leans close, his hush wrapped in careful words. Before him lies a scrap of parchment, corners weighted with small stones to keep the hush from fluttering in the breeze. This hush lists names, men pulled from quiet farms or merchant decks, their hush carried away when sails slipped the hush of safe harbors. For each name, a hush of value, a sum weighed in coin, cloth, or grain, a figure so precise it seems the hush of chains might weigh less than the hush of silver stacked neat inside a locked chest. Ransom hush hums through these rooms like a secret prayer. Envoys slip between towns and fortress gates, carrying letters sealed in wax that hums hush from father to son, from brother to brother, from hush to hush, so carefully guarded that no stray word can break its promise too soon. Sometimes the hush rides the lips of men who bargain for others. An elder cousin leaning against a carved pillar, his hush careful not to show how many coins he hides behind his belt. A priest called to speak hush in the language of trust, weaving faith into hush, so the captors know this hush will hold true when the tide carries the freed man back home. But not every hush pays out clean. A hush promised may drift away in storms. Ships lost with hush locked in barrels, never opened again. A hush offered may arrive too late, finding the name crossed off a hush list, sealed tight in the captain's log. Then, hush folds over families who whisper prayers for hush that will never knock at the courtyard gate again. Still, many hushes find their way through. In bustling ports, freed men shuffle ashore, wrapped in cloaks that smell faintly of hush turned damp below deck. They stand under fig trees where hush lingers sweet in the shade, waiting for a name to be called, a hush of welcome that lifts the weight of salt and iron from weary shoulders. Sometimes hush binds captor and captive closer than either will ever say aloud. A ransom hush carries not just coin, but quiet understanding. The hush that today's captive may tomorrow be a broker himself, whispering hush into a new deal when the tide brings another hush to shore. And while hush drifts through ledgers and candlelit counting rooms, it drifts back down to the hold, too. Men chained to benches listen for footsteps above, for the hush of a letter received, a hush of coins counted out, the hush of boots approaching to lift iron free at last. They carry that hush inside the hush of every oar pull, each stroke a quiet hope that hush might shift before the next headland appears. So the hush of ransom moves on soft feet, softer than iron, softer than thunder. It weaves through merchant houses, hums beneath archways, clinks gently into chests that open hush just wide enough to buy back breath, name, and the hush of freedom promised when chains fall away. The hush of ransom moves in circles wider than any single courtyard, far inland, where the hush of waves is just a memory told by traders and old soldiers. Families sit by oil lamps, whispering hush over parchment scraps, inked with unfamiliar names. Scribes hired to shape the hush of a plea that must cross miles of coast and countless hushes at sea to reach the right hand. Sometimes the hush hums from village to village, neighbors pooling hush of coin and grain to buy back a cousin or a son whose hush vanished with a coastal raid. It passes through counting houses, too, where old men mark hush on ledgers lined in neat columns. This hush for a freed farmer's son, that hush for a merchant's hush, taken when sails turned unlucky. A hush of urgency breathes through it all. Each day a hush lingers. The cost drifts higher. Captors know hush grows softer when hope stretches too thin, so they test it gently. A hush of messengers paid to carry words back and forth. A hush of threats couched in polite phrases that never name the hush outright, but press it heavy on those who listen. In port taverns, where hush never quite sleeps, talk drifts among cups of watered wine and roasted chickpeas. Who paid hush last week? Whose hush lies unclaimed because no family hush could reach far enough? Whispers slip hush into new hands. Traders who carry word upriver. Priests who fold hush into sermons about mercy and the cost of hush left unpaid. Sometimes hush breaks free through unlikely cracks. A captive might bargain his own hush from a cell or a quiet corner below deck, promising land rights, future favors, secret routes known only to him. Some hush never sees coin at all, but trades favor for silence. Free me now, and when hush turns, my tongue will guard your secrets better than any lock. Not all hush returns whole. Some men come back leaner than the hush that left, their hush broken down to rough cloaks, hollow eyes, and the hush of chains that never fully leave wrists, even after iron unlocks. They stand blinking at sunlit courtyards, feeling hush settle into skin again, trying to trust the hush of home after so many nights of hush pressed tight in dark holds. Yet even the hardest hush hums with relief when the bargain holds. At the city gate, mothers press coins into the hush of a priest's hand, asking that his hush carry word of safe return before a father's hush grows too thin with waiting in tiled courtyards. Scribes wipe sweat from brows as hush turns paper to parchment slips sealed in wax and carried on horses that clatter hush through dusty lanes. Corsairs, to watch hush move. A captain's hush can ride on a ransom paid smooth. Hush turned favor at a bay's door when coin buys more than freedom. A promise not to raid the same coast next season. A hush traded for news about rival sails, slipping hush into coves thought safe. So the hush loops back on itself, coins exchanged, chains lifted, a name called under fig trees, heavy with hush of late sun. For a moment, hush drifts sweet, breath drawn deep by a freed man, tasting hush without iron for the first time in seasons. Then the hush folds into memory, tucked under skin as the next tide readies a new hush to sail. In this hush, coin is never just coin. It is hush made solid, the soft weight that unlocks doors, lifts iron from ankles, and folds a man's name back into the hush of family, where no wave can steal it away again. Beyond the hush of crowded docks and courtyard gates, another hush settles behind walls thicker than any hull or fortress parapet. Here the hush hums through polished marble floors and carved doors that close soft but tight, keeping secrets folded in hush so deep it shapes the flow of coins and sails alike. Picture yourself in this hush, standing near the arch of a court chamber, where the hush drifts between tapestries heavy with gold thread and a ceiling painted with stories of hush turned empire. Ottoman judges in long robes carry this hush like a second skin. They listen as hush pleads its case in low voices, merchants arguing over hush lost to storms, captains defending hush that drifted too close to forbidden shores. Here, a man's hush can rise or vanish with the tilt of a signet ring pressed into hot wax. A hush of pardon for a captain whose raid bent the hush of a treaty too far, or a hush of exile if the hush costs more than it buys. In this hush, words matter more than cannon. A sentence shaped just so can hush a fleet for a season, or unlock hush that drifts wide again when war's hush suits the court's balance. Captains know how to bend hush here, too. Picture a great cabin at sea, polished wood, a map unrolled on a wide table, ink pots brimming hush into new roots that promise thunder tomorrow and hush the next day. A seasoned Corsair stands here with his hush wrapped in soft words, a promise to deliver hush in coin and captives, a hush of loyalty that drifts back to Istanbul in letters carried under trusted seals. His hush must answer many masters, the hush of the Sultan's favor, the hush of local bays who guard the hush of ports that feed his fleet, the hush of crews who trust that his hush buys them iron and bread enough to keep rowing. If his hush fails, if a raid goes poorly, if coin drifts the wrong way, the hush folds tight around him, snapping shut like a lock that leaves no plank to stand on. Petitions hum through these courts, too, a village elder pressing hush folded into a plea. Spare our coast this season. Grant us hush under your flag so no rival hush strikes first. Sometimes it works. A hush granted means tax paid, hush pledged for safe passage, hush carried back to stone houses that sleep easier under fluttering banners, promising protection few will test. Yet, behind each decree and signature hums another hush, the hush of those who bend the law without ever saying so aloud, envoys who slide hush under the table, scribes who slip hush into margins of ledgers that vanish when the hush grows inconvenient. A hush here can buy a man out of chains or slip him deeper into them if he misreads the hush behind a judge's calm smile. So hush hums through these high places just as surely as it does in salt holds or dark holds below deck. It drifts under domes, tiled in blue and green, where hush echoes off marble courtyards, where fountains splash hush over couriers waiting for news. It flickers in the hush of a captain's cabin, when oil lamps swing while a pen scratches. Hush onto parchment bound for distant coasts. For every hush that shapes thunder at sea, a softer hush hums behind it. The hush of law, of favor, of promises folded between lines that no blade can cut clean. It keeps the hush moving, from galleys to courts, from judges to captains. From hush spoken in moonlit raids to hush inked in quiet halls far from the salt hush of the tide. This hush of law and favor is softer than a sail snapping wide in the hush of dawn, yet stronger, two binding holes, and men with a promise few dare test outright. Inside shaded audience halls, where carved screens cast hush-shaped shadows onto tiled floors. Men sit cross-legged on cushions stitched with silk, their hush pressed low so no listening ear catches what must drift only between their breath and the hush of power waiting beyond the next door. A bay's hush hums, different from a captain's. The bay holds the hush of a whole port in his signet ring. Grain taxes weighed hush against the hush of safe moorings. Hush traded in dates and salt and bolt cloth stored safe behind gates only his hush may open. A captain's hush, in turn, hums through ledgers hidden in strongboxes, nailed to a cabin floor that shifts with every wave but never spills its hush unless the key turns with care. In between these hushes, scribes shape the flow. They dip pens into ink that glides hush onto scrolls sealed tight under pressed wax. So soft a hush no blade can cut it, but every hole must answer when the hush hums from a bay's chamber out across the tide. One hush forgotten in the right margin can sink a fleet, cut a man loose from favor, or drift hush like a rumor into the wrong hall, where enemies wait for hush to slip. And hush does slip. A promise made in court might hum different once sails catch the wind. A Corsair who bows low before a marble dais may carry a hush in his mind no ink can bind. An idea for a raid so quiet it slides beneath the hush of treaties, humming soft through moonlight until iron breaks hush wide open again. Yet hush binds as much as it tempts. A captain who trades hush too freely risks being left outside every port's hush when the wind turns harsh and the hull needs fresh timber, new iron, dried fish, and grain. A bey who breaks hush too easily finds the Sultan's hush drawn tight as iron chain. A hush that can exile as quick as it once granted protection. Servants know this hush too. Pages slip messages, folded small undersleeves, whispering hush into waiting ears behind painted doors. Guards stand hush at gates, but catch each hush that leaks through tiled halls. Small gossip woven into hush that might one day buy them passage off the city's hush altogether, if offered to the right hush at the right hush of night. Sometimes the hush drifts far beyond the court's hush. Letters written here sail hush through winds that carry them east to Istanbul's hush-heavy gates, west to rival hushes among islands bristling with forts. An order sealed in hush one evening may not crack open for months. When a captain reads hush by lantern's hush in a cabin pitching under salt spray. And so the hush circles back. It rides on the hush of oars, dipping through dawn fog. It hums, under sails dyed the same hush as the waters they cross. It slides through coin, counted out in hush-filled vaults, through words bent to hush that never quite breaks into thunder until the moment comes when hush must yield to iron, but only for a breath, before the hush drifts back in to bind the storm quiet again. In this hush of courts and captains, storms are plotted, truces drafted, chains lifted or dropped with the hush of a single word. It is hush as law, hush as favor, hush as shield, softer than wind, yet heavier than iron. The same hush that hums tonight under domes, and not every hush holds steady. Along these coasts, in these courts and cabins, hush drifts in and out of men's hands like water cupped too loosely, slipping through fingers when the wind shifts or the promise of coin turns hush brittle. This is the next segment of the Corsairs of the Azure Archipelago, a collaborative pirate world-building project by myself and a team of writers. Make sure to check out the rest of our work, including maps, lore, and even our own custom shipbuilding tool on our website. Here in Port Royal, Captain Cassia has made herself rare, hiding away in a mansion she acquired the same way as most fortunes here, plunder and trickery. She watches the docks through spyglasses from her tower and listens to scraps of song and scuttlebutt carried on the tide. Mostly, she waits for news of the great Khanate fleet sailing west from Canton. Across town, the Tayani merchant Daoud al-Hazari paces his courtyard, the finer things in life tarnished by worry. His flagship, the Sapphire, robed with precious stones, hangs askew at its moorings after last night's gale, and his shipment of forbidden books lies soaked and unsold. But worse, he hasn't heard from his contact with the Jade Hand in weeks, and soon he must ship word and coin west to keep their truce from hardening to war. Meanwhile, Captain Zafar struggles to set anchor in his adopted home. Born in Muscat, raised in Gujarat, he commanded fleets for both, and now finds himself unwanted in both ports. unable to fit into the schemes of either. With a nose for trade and the taste of blood on his lips, he seeks something more open, someplace to build his own fortune, and fortune he will. The sea pays those who take, not those who ask. And in a crumbling temple on the far side of town, a young woman named Zara fasts, wrapped in prayer rug and dark thoughts. The faithful tell her to pray for the jade hand, for her city, for guidance. But all she thinks of is leaving, going anywhere the fog of incense and memory doesn't follow. For 4 years, she's watched the city suffer, its wounds dressed over with silk, and said prayers, and she fears her own faith might be the sickness spreading. When lives turn on the tides, their stories mingle and converge in ways they cannot see. But just beneath the surface of Port Royal, the hush moves and murmurs. Here in the shadow of the mountains, the sea is never far away. From balconies and battlements, people lean to watch sails crawl up the horizon, each one a whisper of story, some carrying home, others bringing ruin. Some are vessels of hope, some of despair, and others concealing both. The Tajani have built their houses to capture the sea breeze and the view. Above, terracotta roofs gleam in the sun, and below, painted shutters hide courtyards deep in shadow. Most walls are blank, but one house displays a mural of the sea, churning and calm, vast and deep, encompassing the whole world. Its waves bear ships from distant lands, riding crests of turquoise and foam, bearing treasures untold and tales to be traded over goblets of spiced wine. Behind that wall, Dowd stands and watches the jade hand ships come and go, imagining the bustling markets of Cathay and the wild shores of the West, wondering which tales will find purchase in his city, which secrets will he carry, which ones break his back. In the merchant's house opposite his, Captain Cassio lounges on cushions in the shade of a sail, watching the jade handships through her own spyglass. Her quartermaster, a wiry man with the nimbleness of a cat, scrambles up and down ladders to retrieve her mail. The captain reads her missives, deciphered by a slave girl who hides ink stains on her fingers with henna. All across town, people talk of truce and war with the jade hand. Cassie knows her fortune depends on knowing what they don't, on selling the right information to the highest bidder. Even the humblest dock rat, balancing on a piling as he repairs a hull, knows the sea gives up its secrets to those who listen. If you bring nothing but noise and greed, the sea will drown you. But if you bring silence and patience, she will tell you anything you want to hear. On the other side of the city, the young priestess Zara kneels in her temple, hiding her face in her hands. Her shawl is threadbare, her bare feet cold on the stone floor. Though she hasn't eaten in days, her hunger is a distraction from a deeper ache, the sense that her God is turning away from the city. Once, this temple bustled with activity. Now only the ghosts of incense linger in its shadows. As Zara prays, she pictures the western seas stretching before her, a path leading away from sorrow and responsibility. Maybe there, God will speak to her and forgive her for wanting to run. But then she remembers the faces of the sick and the dying, and she pushes away her doubts, wrapping her arms around her knees. As long as there is breath in her body, she will stay and tend to the sick, hoping God will show them all mercy. Across the city, 3 paths converge in the market district. Each of them wants something from the others, but none know how to begin. Dowd meets Zara as she buys figs from a peddler, his eyes kind, his hands gnarled by age and hard work. He asks her how the sick fare, and she tells him the truth. that some will die, but others live. The two recognize the burden they share, though neither could say why it matters. Meanwhile, a man in a fine coat approaches Cassia's house, his silk sash the color of the jade hand's sails. He carries a package wrapped in oiled paper and sealed with wax. Moments later, he reaches Zafar's boarding house, clutching his package close. The merchant's gaze follows him, and he turns away when he sees them meeting. That night, as the stars bloom over Port Royal, lives turn on whispers. Cassia offers Zafar protection, trading knowledge for company. She needs someone to move in the open while she lurks in the shadows. He needs her resources to carve out a place in the city. Their alliance is born out of convenience, a joining of predator and scavenger. Neither sees how they need each other, only what they stand to gain. But in the shadowy corner of the room, another presence watches and listens. A humble servant, barely visible in the lamplight, his hands folded, his eyes lowered. He hears the bargain struck, the dreams spun, and the plans laid. And in the morning, he'll carry the hush of their bargain to the highest bidders, collecting the coins they fling away without a second thought. Dodd sends his son out of the city to warn the Jade Hand, praying his messenger won't become another casualty of the uneasy peace. On his way, he passes Zara coming into the city, carrying figs heavy in their late-season prime. She walks barefoot, oblivious to the danger, her steps light, her gaze fixed on the road ahead. A ship arrives from the south, bringing not only spice and silks, but news of storms and strife. Storms and strife that will affect everyone here, but no one realizes it yet. Only the sea knows the connections that bind us all. Only the sea knows the connections that bind us all. Stories tangle like fishing nets, hauling unlikely companions together, and sometimes tearing friends apart. Soon, the fragile peace here will break. Captain Cassius Hush will lead Zafar into a trap laid by her rivals. Doe's son will reach the Jade Hand fleet too late, or perhaps he'll sell his father's hush for gold in a port Dodd thought safe. And Zara will walk right into the middle of it all, drawn by the needs of the sick and the sound of voices calling her name. Because here in Port Royal, the hush of the sea turns on itself, a circle drawn in salt and rumor, promises half kept and half forgotten. Between every alliance struck and every hush traded for a blade lies the quiet truth that Corsairs know too well. The hush of the sea forgives everything in time, folding old hush under new, wave upon wave, until all betrayals hum quiet again beneath the hush of wind and tide. When the hush of iron grows too sharp and the hush of coin drifts too far, another hush rises to meet it, softer, older, woven through breath and heartbeat alike. It hums in prayers, murmured on deck when dawn lifts hush off the horizon, in charms stitched into the hems of tunics, in amulets pressed tight to the chest, when waves pitch hush too high for any man to master alone. Picture yourself leaning against the low rail of a galley at dusk, the hush of the oars stilled for now. Beside you, a rower traces a finger along a wooden bead strung on a cord around his wrist. A hush given by his mother the day he first stepped into the hush of salt and chain. Each bead carries a hush of promise. Return safe, come home whole. Let the hush of this charm carry you through the hush that waits where sails drift out of sight. Corsairs, for all their iron and thunder, are no strangers to hush born of faith. In small corners of cramped decks, they spread mats that hold the hush of prayers facing east. On quiet beaches before a raid, some scoop hush from the sea to wash hands and brow, carrying the hush of salt as shield against hush turned blade. The hush of fortune hums too in signs read in the hush of weather. An unexpected hush of calm when storms should rage might mean hush holds a trap ahead. Gulls circling low can break the hush of a captain's certainty faster than a scout's warning. A hush of fish driven shallow by rocks that might wait to splinter a hull's hush in the hush of night tide. Below deck, small hushes travel hidden in rough pouches tied at the waist. A scrap of cloth torn from a mother's veil. A coin pressed to the lips of a saint's statue, now tucked deep against the hush of the belly. A tiny book of verses that hums hush even when the hush of chains hums heavier still. When hush grows tense before battle, men seek hush in fortune told, quiet as breath. A line read in the hush of a palm, the hush of a charm passed hand to hand under lantern light. A word from an old sailor who knows which bird's hush at dusk means good tide, and which means the hush might snap open too soon. For all their cunning and iron, corsairs drift through hush, just as sailors always have. One hush to the wind, another to the waves, and another to whatever hush listens beyond the hush of the world men can name. Some captains keep hush close to the chest, small relics hidden in polished boxes. Soft tokens kissed before dawn, sails break hush and carry them toward shores where hush might fail. Even in courts and counting houses, faith drifts through hush like smoke through lattice screens. A bay may wear hush on his finger, a carved stone ring, a hush pressed with words too old to doubt. Scribes tap hush into ledgers, marking not just coin and chain, but prayers for hush that wealth alone cannot command. And so the hush of blessings drifts always beside the hush of thunder. It hums in lullabies sung under salt breath. When storms lift hush off the deck, it rides in lanterns, swaying above benches, where rowers watch each drop of hush that leaks through seams, hoping the hush of a whispered name is enough to carry them past rocks waiting in hush just below the tide. When hush drifts soft, it wraps fear gentle for a while. It reminds every man that iron can break, coin can vanish. But hush carried in faith hums on, quiet as the breath between waves, patient as the hush of a mother's promise folded deep in a hidden pocket where no salt wind can steal it away. This hush that hums between prayers and omens does not belong to any single deck or port. It follows the hush of men wherever they drift, pressed under tunics, tied around wrists, folded into the hush of breath, shared with no one but the hush that listens when no other hush can. On moonless nights, when the hush of waves slips softer than usual, old men sit cross-legged near bow rails, humming hush into beads that catch the hush of lantern glow like tiny embers. They roll each bead between rough fingers, feeling the hush of remembered hands. A wife's hush folded in a parting gift, a sister's hush knotted tight, so the hush of the sea does not steal him too soon. The hush of omens slides in to a gull perching quiet on the rail where no bird ought to rest, might mean the hush of wind waits wrong beyond the headland. A sudden hush of rain at noon can turn a captain's hush heavy, murmuring orders that change a course by leagues to spare the hush of hull and crew. Sometimes the hush hums in sleep. Men dream of hush that carries them home, past storms and betrayal and the hush of iron turned cold on the wrist. They wake to the hush of chains or rope pressed back onto flesh. But for a moment the hush of that dream clings soft, a hush warmer than salt spray, stronger than the hush of fear folded into every tide. On land, hush finds its own quiet shrines, small mosques tucked behind whitewashed walls, prayer beads coiled on narrow shelves where incense folds hush into sunlit arches. A Corsair might kneel here before a raid, hush pressed into palms open to the hush of God's promise. A merchant mother might light hush in oil lamps, sending hush on smoke that drifts over dunes to reach a sun whose hush rose through black water far beyond the hush of home. Faith hums through every hush traded for fortune. A captain's hush is never only iron and oaths. He keeps hush wrapped in verses, scratched on scraps of vellum, tied to the mast where only he knows they hum with the hush of protection. A charm sewn into the corner of a sail, a hush of words older than the empire's hush, might be the only hush a crew trusts when thunder hums too close. Sometimes hush speaks louder in what men do not say. A hush of fingers tapping wood 3 times when talk of storms slips out too freely. A hush of bread broken with the left hand, wine poured with the right. Because some hush hums that balance must hold, or the sea's hush will not forgive. Below deck, hush presses deeper still. Men chained at the oar may slip tiny hushes from hand to hand. A carved bead traded for a scrap of dried fruit. A hush of blessing pressed from one palm to another, so soft no guard's hush ever catches it. For them, hush hums hope in the smallest shape, the hush of a single word murmured like a secret only the tide understands. And always, hush drifts back when iron rattles too loud, or the hush of betrayal hums up through trusted boards. When coin fails, when storms split sails, when hush seems too thin to hold, then hush folds back to faith. A man lowers his head into his own hush, breathes out his hush into the hush between waves, and waits for the hush of a new tide to carry him through. So the hush of blessings holds steady, tucked deep where salt cannot wear it thin. In beads, in charms, in verses caught between ribs and dreams. It hums softer than iron, yet stronger than any hush the sea might steal. And when hush returns at dawn, men stand in its quiet, ready once more to lift iron, to trade hush for hush, but never quite without the hush of faith folded, warm inside. Beneath deck beams dark with salt and sweat, small movements begin when guards turn away. A wrist twists carefully. A link shifts with a tiny scrape. One man lifts his eyes to meet another's. Just a nod, barely more than a breath. The message is clear. Soon, when the oars stop, when the tide favors silence more than any watchman's lantern, escape often begins with a whisper traded under cover of sleep. Small secrets travel man to man, pressed into calloused palms, along with scraps of stale bread or the warmth of a shoulder in the cold. A stable boy is paid to leave a gate unbarred. A fisherman rows close beneath the cover of night, his skiff riding low and empty, ready to carry a few souls just beyond reach of the galley's lanterns. Freedom never feels certain. Even when chains fall away, every footstep risks giving it back. Oars slip into the water with no splash. Boots press lightly on sand that might betray them with a stray print. Every breath is measured, not too quick, not too loud. The sea ahead promises little more than the chance to vanish into the folds of darkness. Before any shouts can gather the wind, they change tongue and clothes, find work far from the salt breath of decks they once rode in the dark. Some vanish into forests, villages, mountain passes, places where no captain's ledger or bay's seal holds weight. Now and then, a guard's eyes soften. A key finds its way to the floor with no questions asked. A lookout turns his head just long enough for a rope to be dropped over a hull's side. These small kindnesses drift down the years, old favors repaid in quiet ways. When thunder no longer matters as much as seeing a man's back turned to the sea at last. Some are caught before the shore is close enough to taste. Shackles return, iron heavier than before. For these, hope may bend, but rarely breaks. New plans begin in low voices, stitched together in long hours of rowing, waiting for the next storm or careless watch to open a door that never stays locked forever. Passing quiet tales over bread and wine. The ones who tested their courage against the tide and left no name behind. Each escape is a small breath of promise for the ones still chained to the bench. Proof that the sea carries more than salt and iron. It carries the memory of footsteps in sand, a boat drifting past the headland, and the chance to disappear into the dark without a word spoken louder than the wind. Studying the shift patterns of the men who guard the lower deck, an extra ration traded for a scrap of wire, a nod exchanged across the benches when the overseer's boots echo too far aft to hear. A rope coiled carelessly by a young deckhand might end up hidden behind barrels of salt pork, ready to lower someone into the dark water when the right night comes. Might leave a loaf of bread and a water skin near the edge of a jetty, saying nothing to the man she knows will come at midnight. A stable master looks the other way when someone beds down for an hour in the straw, waiting for the city gates to open at dawn. They slip into orchards at night, trade their salt-crusted tunics for rough village cloth, and vanish among olive groves and low stone walls where no captain's list can find them again. If they're lucky, they join families who ask no questions, so long as the stranger pulls his weight at harvest, mends roofs before the rain, and keeps the old stories to himself. A half-empty barrel rolled into the surf to cover the missing weight. Dogs sniff the sand at dawn, and iron comes clinking down back lanes to catch those who could not run far enough before sunrise. when they are caught, the price is heavy. More iron, fewer scraps of food, longer nights chained where oars drip brine onto raw wrists. Yet the stories of those who made it out drift back anyway. Rumors spread faster than the chain can reach, of a man who traded his stolen rowboat for a place in a caravan bound east, never to see the coast again. Of a runaway who slipped into the fortress kitchens, disguised as a stable boy, then vanished through the back gate with half a loaf under his arm and a clear road into the hills. These stories keep the benches alive with quiet hope. When the oars pull steady in the dark, men lean forward, shoulder to shoulder, and whisper tiny pieces of what might be possible. They plan routes through thorny paths behind watchtowers. They name hidden coves where no torchlight reaches. They share which guard dozes first, and who can be bribed with a copper piece slipped under stale bread. Sometimes these plans drift past the men chained in place and find willing hands above deck. A deckhand who fears next month's thunder might slip away too. The clink of a stolen blade in his belt, and the promise of a warm room far inland where no one asks what flag he once served. So it goes. Iron, salt, wind, and the quiet courage that tests every lock, every careless watch, every stretch of dark water too wide for any captain to control. The sea gives and takes, but it remembers the ones who stepped lightly into night and did not come back. Their footprints fade, but their freedom leaves a mark behind. A small promise that tomorrow someone else will find their own slip of dark water and soft wind and vanish into it, carrying nothing heavier than the memory of the bench they left behind. When the sails are furled and the oars hang dry against the hull, what remains often isn't the creak of rope or the echo of chains, but the stories men tell about them long after the salt has washed from their hands. Imagine a small tavern tucked behind whitewashed walls, lanterns swaying gently over low tables stained with old wine, and the hush of conversations half finished. Here, a sailor sits with a cup warming his palms, telling of a night when a single rower slipped his chains with a file smuggled in a crust of bread. He tells it slow, savoring each detail as though he watched it himself. The splash so quiet no one woke, the footprints gone before sunrise, the empty bench that made the overseer curse the dawn. Whether it happened quite that way hardly matters. What lingers is the shape of the tale, stitched together by each man who repeats it. In the next port, the runaway becomes 3 men, then 6, all vanished into the dark, to take service with another fleet, or to settle under orchard trees far from salt and iron. Not every legend softens the truth. Some grow sharper with each retelling. Captains are named whose iron grip never slipped, whose galleys ghosted through storms, while rival ships scattered like dry leaves in a sudden squall. These stories are told by men who remember cannon thunder and the sharp smell of powder drifting over the deck. They lower their voices when they speak of raids at dawn, lanterns snuffed before shore sentries could shout, entire villages waking to find the sea already stealing away again. At the same time, the tales feed on small kindnesses too. In one version, a lookout once turned his eyes just long enough to let an oarsman slip away. In another, a cook's apprentice passed bread and coins through a half-open hatch before vanishing into the city crowds. These soft corners matter as much as the iron and salt. They remind those who listen that not every heart aboard a Corsair galley stayed chained to the same cause. Around warm hearths inland, the same stories drift in different shapes. Children listen wide-eyed to tales of swift raids and fierce captains, of treasure buried on islands where only gulls keep watch now. Mothers murmur softer versions, warnings wrapped in memory. Stay clear of the sea's promise. Listen to the wind. A flag can change overnight. For the captains who once held these truths in their palms, the stories can sting as much as they comfort. A raid that won them favor in the court becomes, in another man's mouth, a story of needless cruelty. A single escape from a chained bench twists into a ballad sung by poets who never smelled tar or brine. Yet they let the tales drift. Each one becomes another small sail catching wind, carrying names farther than any or ever could. What is true? What is invention? Few bother to argue when the cup is warm in the hand and the night is gentle enough to listen. Long after a captain's bones rest beneath a stone, long after a runaway's footsteps fade into olive groves and dusty roads, far from any port the stories breathe on. They soften the hard edges of chain and thunder, drifting from mouth to mouth in back rooms, courtyard corners, and the quiet benches of ships yet to leave the harbor. So the old legends live, a boy's promise to row only until his chance comes, a mother's hush over a charm stitched into her son's collar, a captain's boast retold by someone who never served under him, but swears he heard the sails creak in the wind just that way. And by these stories, the sea remembers, not as iron remembers, but as voices do, shifting, fading, returning, carrying salt and rumor in equal measure. A tide of memory rolling in long after the last oar rests still. There comes a moment when every tide pulls back its salt breath, leaving behind only the faint lines of what passed before. So to do these echoes of the Corsair's world slip slowly into the long quiet, a quiet deeper than any chain, wider than any promise whispered under flickering lanterns. Imagine the last hull pulled onto a lonely beach where the wind hums through planks bleached gray by seasons of sun and forgotten storms. Barnacles cling to seams where salt water once crept in. Ropes fray in the breeze, their fibers drifting apart, grain by grain. The deck no longer rocks under bare feet or the steady push of oars. It rests flat against the sand, giving itself back to the shore a little more each year. Nearby footprints, once pressed into soft dunes, have long blown smooth. A watchtower, stones stacked by careful hands, now crumbles at its corners where gulls perch in the hush of dawn. Below, in small coves, driftwood and broken ribs of old boats lie half buried under tangles of seaweed and shells. Each piece a silent reminder of raids once planned and prayers once offered in tight holds below deck. Far inland, the quiet holds a different memory. It lives in small graves under olive trees where a runaway's bones might rest. It lingers in the hush of families who speak certain names only at dusk, soft enough that the wind carries them off before they reach the next courtyard wall. The coins once counted out to lift chains from wrists gather dust in locked chests or lie deep under flagstones worn smooth by children's feet. Ledger pages fade where damp air curls the edges. The quiet here holds no promises of thunder, no sharp snap of sails or splash of oars, only the faint breath of history, softer than any command barked across a wind-whipped deck. For the few who still stand at a harbor's edge when the sky turns deep, watching sails drift toward horizons that once promised coin or ruin, the sea hums softer now. They know the truth the old corsairs learned and buried beneath iron and salt. No wind stays strong forever. No chain stays locked without a key waiting somewhere. No name roars so loud it can't be folded into a quiet story told beside a warm hearth. So this long quiet gathers up all that came before, the chained hands, the whispered bargains, the sudden storms, the soft prayers, the silent flights. It holds them gently, smoothing each sharp edge until only calm remains. If you listen for it tonight, you might hear it too. The soft creak of an empty hull turned to driftwood, the low call of gulls wheeling above a watchtower worn to stone, the hush of the tide pulling old secrets back into deeper water where they rest easy, far from thunder, far from iron, far from the oar's steady pull. And if sleep comes as you listen, let it carry you with it, away from creaking planks and coin counted in shadows, away from dark holds and hidden keys, toward a quiet shore where no chain binds, no sail snaps, and the last echo of the Corsair's world drifts out to sea, leaving you warm, safe, and free to dream in the soft hush of the night.